My name is Mariah Gruner, and I'm a PhD candidate in American Studies at Boston University. And this is my talk, The Tethering Stitch, the Liberating Stitch, the Frictions of Abolitionist Women's Needlework, recorded for the Decorative Arts Trust Emerging Scholars Symposium. Before I begin, I'd like to make a note that as I reference the work of the abolitionists that I engage with, I will be quoting some language that I would not use otherwise to describe race or identity. This for me has been something of an object lesson in the changing language used by thinkers seriously engaged with social justice and equity, but I wanted to acknowledge that in quoting these authors I will be using terms that are no longer used to describe race. Several years ago, I encountered Angelina Grimke's 1836 appeal to the Christian women of the South in a course on the history of feminist thought. Angelina and her sister Sarah were born in Charleston, South Carolina, to a wealthy slaveholding family in 1805 and 1792, respectively, and moved to Philadelphia as adults, where they became renowned anti-slavery activists who challenged antebellum gender norms, refusing to accept the de facto and de jure forms of exclusion that alienated women from political life. In her 1836 appeal, Angelina Grimke argues that women have a moral imperative to act politically and publicly, and in so doing describes a surprising practice. She describes women's needlework as an explicitly political activity. She speaks to women's domestic affairs as already politically infused. Angelina Grimke writes that women of the North are, quote, telling the story of the colored man's wrongs, praying for his deliverance, and representing his kneeling image constantly before the public eye on bags and needlebooks, card racks, pen wipers, pincushions, etc. Even the children of the North are inscribing on their handiwork, "May the points of our needles prick the slaveholder's conscience," end quote. This line goes rather unexplored in her larger work, but it struck me deeply and has animated this portion of my dissertation work, assuring me that explicitly anti-slavery needlework was a known practice at the time, even when archival evidence can sometimes feel slim. At the very least, Grimke understood needlework as a practice both at home, with period understandings of appropriate women's domestic activities, and as a radical way to participate in abolitionist organizing and fundraising. Once I was able to find a few extant examples, her words have helped me understand these individual and often anonymous works as part of a broader network, an understood practice, a rhetorical universe. His kneeling image meant, I came to realize, a very specific image. The Josiah Wedgwood seal. Commissioned in 1787 by the British Committee to abolish the slave trade, Josiah Wedgwood, a fine craftsman in pottery and keen businessman, worked with his chief modeler, William Hackwood, to design this emblem, which became enormously popular in Britain and eventually in the United States. And although Grimke speaks of his kneeling image, I soon came to discover the emergence of a feminized version of this icon, seen in print in England by 1826, and in the United States by 1830, often marking anti-slavery efforts helmed by or directed at women. The image, commonly used in print culture, also became a way to mark textiles with anti-slavery sentiments. But this translation into cloth, the bags, needlebooks, and pin cushions described by Grimke, involves a fundamental shift in the object's implications. It calls up a host of associations with femininity, domesticity, softness, and delicacy. Given Grimke's words, for example, this object makes sense as one within a recognizable group, not simply reflective of a maker's idiosyncratic taste or vision. This octagonal needlebook, externally bound in floral blue silk brocade, bears its message on the inner face of its faded peach-toned silk surface, a feminized version of the Josiah Wedgwood seal. Image and attendant text press up against a neat row of needles when closed, perhaps infusing them with sentiment. The figures depicted are rendered intelligible through their bodily postures. One woman kneels in apparent supplication, the other extends her hand and sympathy. These postures structure the encounter, though rendered in outline, their races, troublingly, are implied by who is supplicating and who is sympathetic. Their bodies are framed. The text, "Am I not a woman and a sister?" arches over their heads. Beneath their feet, the text reads, "Remember them that are in bonds, as bound with them." It is a curious object, at once delicate and emphatic, squarely domestic, and also invested in public life. It is soft silk and fine lines, an object that quietly closes and hides its stark messaging. But it also contains the cold promise of a needle's puncture. It is anonymous and undated, though it was likely made between 1830 and 1850, but it is also remarkably specific, perhaps purchased at an anti-slavery fair, and certainly identifying both the owner and maker as participants in a recognizable iconographic practice associated with antebellum anti-slavery activism. It is the first object associated with abolitionist needlework that I was ever able to see in person, a tiny window into a world of little-known practices, relationships, and conversations, an object that continues to illuminate for me some of the central tensions in white women's anti-slavery activism in the antebellum era. I'm an American Studies scholar, working at the intersections of gender and material culture scholarship. I'm most interested in craft, typically understood as feminine and domestic, and exploring how those categories get constructed. How does craft become gendered, and how is gender crafted? More specifically, I research American women's decorative needlework from 1820 to 1920, and the ways in which it's conceived of as paradigmatically domestic, feminine, and soft, but simultaneously used for political ends. I explore the meanings that build up in embroidery over time as a medium, technique, and discursive construction. How did it come to be so associated with specific visions of normative femininity? And how did women use those associations for their own purposes? These questions sent me to the archives in search of a feminist history of needlework. It will then be no surprise that Angelina Grimke's words electrified me. Although I came to Grimke's words years ago, this project remained inchoate until this summer when I was fortunate enough to receive a grant from the Decorative Arts Trust to travel to a few archives and encounter the objects in their holdings. Specifically, I went to the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem to examine this needle case, Colonial Williamsburg in Virginia to see this sampler and a few other pieces, like this bag, and historic New England in Haverhill, Massachusetts to see this quilt. These pieces serve as the anchor points in my next dissertation chapter, in which I examine the work of white women in the anti-slavery movement in order to explore the political meanings of work so consistently read as outside of the realm of both work and politics, to understand complex deployments of femininity and domesticity in a political moment that at best uneasily incorporated women as participants. The American Anti-Slavery Society split in 1840 over the question of women's full participation, and the first Women's Rights Convention in 1848 was planned in response to the exclusion of women delegates at the London World Anti-Slavery Convention. Yet women continued to participate in the abolitionist movement as speakers, fundraisers, writers, and even through their own anti-slavery societies and anti-slavery fairs. These fairs were fundraising operations organized by large committees of women and featuring for sale domestic crafts like needlebooks, fancy work embroidery, decorated work bags, quilts, and other objects that might not otherwise be understood as overtly political, objects often made by women who hadn't previously considered themselves either as political actors or as earners. But women's fair and fundraising work was a key source of income for the anti-slavery movement through the 1850s, one that enabled their political participation while maintaining associations with domestic femininity. Indeed, period authors recognized this strategy. A woman wrote into the Hingham Gazette in 1837, arguing that, quote, sewing comes within the appropriate sphere of women, end quote, and thus women's abolitionist activism that used needlework ought to be accepted, seen as an extension of their existing place as moral actors in the domestic realm. Other period texts noted the monetary value of women's domestic crafts and acknowledged this work as labor. Advertisements for the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Fair in 1839 proclaimed, quote, "Never was there a finer display of money's worth," end quote, and called upon readers to note, quote, "how much labor has been expended, how many sacrifices undergone to furnish this array for freedom's sake," end quote. The sale of crafts at anti-slavery fairs and bazaars gave women the opportunity to see themselves as political actors and earners, while still drawing on the associations with domesticity, morality, and women's benevolent work. These fairs confirmed both the economic value of women's domestic or ornamental pursuits and their political force. Many of the objects sold both materially and aesthetically announced their makers' and later purchasers' political commitments. They also enabled women to use the occasion of open political discourse about the evils of unfree labor to think through and insist upon the value of their own domestic work, their own liberty. It's important to bear in mind, for example, that Elizabeth Cady Stanton, among others, emerged from the abolitionist movement and organized around practices like coverture that legally excluded married women from property holding and wage earning. I'm interested then in thinking about what kind of labor was involved in creating anti-slavery crafts, who was transformed by that labor, and what assumptions it challenged, what it helped solidify. For example, I was able to travel with my grant to historic New England's archives in Haverhill, Massachusetts. There I encountered this quilt, sold at the Boston Female Anti-Slavery Fair in 1836. Although the quilt is not signed, it corresponds to a quilt that Lydia Mariah Child described making and selling for $5 at this specific fair, suggesting a lineage in the hands of one of the great abolitionists of the antebellum era. The quilt is stitched in an unassuming, classic evening star motif. It is a cradle quilt meant for a child's bed, and small, only 36 by 46 inches, closely worked in fine hand stitching. Its colors are muted and soft, an accumulation of printed cotton blocks in pink, blue, and brown star patterns. At first glance, this is not a remarkable quilt. However, the maker clearly played upon the quilt's anticipated home in a cradle, using the implied anticipation of a maternal, sentimental scene as an occasion to insert an overtly political message. Delicately inked in the quilt's central star is a handwritten stanza from Eliza Lee Cabot Follin's poem, Remember the Slave. Quote, "Mother, when around your child you clasp your arms in love, and when with grateful joy you raise your eyes to God above, think of the Negro mother when her child is torn away. Sold for a little slave, oh, for that poor mother pray." End quote. This poem demonstrates the political stakes threaded through the maternal relationship and the domestic scene, asking women to consider the contrast between their moments of relative domestic serenity and the fundamental cruelties of enslavement. It harnesses the softness of the quilt and contrasts it with the puncture of political commentary. It uses a primary juxtaposition, that between the anticipated softness of the quilt, the gentle embrace and maternal scene it promises, and the puncture of direct, frank discussions of pain and suffering, to create space for a second juxtaposition, that between the white mother and her enslaved counterpart. I am interested then in this strategy, the juxtaposition of soft practices, objects, and/or makers, and hard messages, while creating opportunities for women to participate in anti-slavery activism in ways understood to be aligned with their roles as mothers and moral forces in the domestic space. These objects also rely on white women's repetition of images of enslaved suffering, images concretized in their needlework labors, and used as occasions to practice or demonstrate their sympathetic faculties. Indeed, abolitionist visual culture and pedagogical strategies often emphasize the importance of developing one's sympathetic abilities, framed as the fruit of repeated effortful labor. In an essay in The Genius of Universal Emancipation, Elizabeth Margaret Chandler wrote that women ought to attempt to mentally conjure themselves in the circumstances of their enslaved counterparts, looking at the "Am I not a woman" image, and imaginatively, quote, letting the fetter be with its weight upon their wrists, end quote. As a note, in my studies at Colonial Williamsburg examining this British work bag, I discovered that Elizabeth Margaret Chandler had a nearly identical one. And here I also want to note that Black women were absolutely involved in anti-slavery organizing in the North. In fact, the Salem Female Anti-Slavery Society, first formed in 1832, the first women's anti-slavery society in the United States, was founded by free Black women. Other female anti-slavery societies, like the Boston and Philadelphia societies, also had Black and white members. However, the bulk of the usage of this seal and representation of images of enslaved suffering clearly address a white audience and emphasize a sense of profound otherness with Black folk that needs to be bridged through the abolitionists' practiced sympathy. In a letter, Angelina Grimke's husband, Theodore Dwight Weld, one of the leaders of the American Anti-Slavery Society, wrote to her of their son, quote, I rejoice that you are taking pains to cultivate little Charlie's sympathy and compassion by showing him the poor slaves. Pray do it often and constantly. The only way effectually to cultivate those elements in the mind of a child is to show them suffering objects, end quote. This potentially reframes Grimke's earlier writing. Is this practice why women are, as Weld wrote, constantly presenting the image of the kneeling slave? Does this repetition constitute an occasion for the cultivation of sympathy? Does it reify the notion that enslaved people are suffering objects? And if so, what does it mean to literally depict these images on objects, to spend time in the repetition and creation of this image? We see this repetition evidenced in objects like this undated, unsigned sampler I was able to examine at Colonial Williamsburg. An anonymous woman stitched the image of a kneeling, chained, enslaved person encased in a floral border, worked in the fashionable Berlin work style. The repeated puncture of the needle here serves as an opportunity for the maker to consider the predicament of the enslaved person, to perhaps imagine her own wrists in chains, as Elizabeth Margaret Chandler suggested. This piece may have been simply produced domestically, not necessarily sold at an anti-slavery fair. It was acquired from an anonymous source in Pennsylvania. However, my hunch is that it was produced in England and sent to the United States as a sign of solidarity between women's anti-slavery groups, indicating the transatlantic nature of the anti-slavery cause and the expansiveness of women's networks. Though its provenance is unknown, it resonates strongly with pieces like this one, Hannah Bloor's English sampler commemorating the 1840 World Anti-Slavery Fair in London, and this piece, almost identical, housed at the Hull Museum in England. Indeed, the text I discovered is a stanza from John Collins' broadside ballad from the 1790s, The Desponding Negro, a popular British song. Close material analysis of this object offered up some other rich interpretive possibilities. Though the piece is worked in wool, both a way to participate in the burgeoning trend of Berlin wool work, which places this piece closer to mid-century, and to eschew the use of cotton, so deeply implicated in the use of slave labor. The chain is worked with silk. Not only that, but the eyes and teeth of the figure are also worked in silk. Perhaps the maker was simply interested in using a thread that would allow her to make more delicate lines, but this does also suggest a sense that she considered there was something intrinsic or bodily about enslavement. At the very least, these objects, though critiquing the current state of affairs, all do participate in their very repetitiveness, both in method and iconography, in a kind of concretizing imagery, potentially securing the image of Blackness as one of supplication and suffering, while enabling white women to expand the strictures of the domestic sphere. As an example of this kind of repeated imagery, I'd like to share a short story written and published by Lydia Mariah Child, the possible maker of the quilt discussed earlier, which she circulated in such children's abolitionist periodicals as The Slave's Friend. In her fable, Child tells of two young free girls, one black, one white, who are captured by slave traders and sold into slavery. The little white girl's face is painted black to enable this fraud. When she realizes, the little white girl that is, the true cruelty of enslavement, she begins to cry, and her tears reveal her white skin beneath the black that was painted on. When her true whiteness is revealed after this emotional transformation, she is freed and sent back to her family in the North, but her young friend, due to her unchanging blackness, remains in slavery. This is the kind of dynamic that I see at play in these textiles, a focus on the liberation of white women through their emotional transformations, and a repetition of the association between blackness and enslavement. The tension between repetition and transformative action is the central logic, I would contend, of, if not abolitionist iconography and rhetoric in general, certainly women's iterations of these practices. Abolitionists' revaluing of repetition and its power to evoke intense affective change and even transformation, as Weld desired for his son, has powerful implications for the political force of needlework and the meaning of the repeated stitch. The needlebook, then, might both evoke a kind of fixedness, both as an object literally used to gather and secure items and as an iteration of this specific emblem, and a mobilizing force, kinetic energy waiting for a stitcher to touch the needles and spark a change. But this, of course, raises the question of who is mobilized and who is fixed, who is liberated in this practice. Is it the white woman who recognizes her ability to both psychically project herself through her stitched sympathies, to imagine herself in another's place, and therefore reveal her sensitivity and moral adroitness, and literally begin to participate more overtly in politics and the marketplace? I do take this work seriously. It indexes, I believe, a sincere opposition to the practice of enslavement and a significant source of funds for abolitionist organizing. But what were the long-standing implications of this work? I only hope to deepen my analysis of these objects and the practices they hint at, to explore why abolitionist women understood domestic needlework as particularly ripe for